to the place where singles shine, celebrating life, divine by design, faith and love, we intertwine. Route 77, where your journey's prime.
Welcome to the Route 77 podcast, where the road may be narrow, but the conversation is wide open. Today, we're tackling a verse that gets thrown at singles more than wedding confetti. Be fruitful and multiply. It's often used as a pushback against a culture that devalues marriage and children, but sometimes, in the process, it ends up pressuring those of us who are single. So what does this verse actually mean in today's world? Is it about reproduction only, or is there more to fruitfulness in God's eyes? Let's unpack what Scripture says, what culture assumes, and how singleness can be a space of faith. Welcome to the Route 77 podcast. I am your host, Natasha, and I am here with Monique and David.
Hello.
I feel like I got a mustache because of the lighting.
I don't.
Well, and it's not hurt because I checked.
Oh, don't worry, I have a mustache.
You'll match David. It's okay.
Not that you can see him.
I don't have a mic yet, or a webcam yet.
Someday he will not just be the avatar that I've created for him on AI.
Maybe when I get my new desk.
There you go.
There you go.
So I just finished writing a paper on the theology of singleness, which I feel meh about because I feel like I should have done more, but it was 3 weeks overdue. The professor was giving me a lot of leeway because I had been sick and I had a death in the family and everything. So I felt like I shouldn't push it any farther because his take as long as you need was probably getting to, well, I didn't mean forever. So anyway, so that's what got my creative juices flowing when it comes to this topic, because I thought I had to go back and unwrap some things before I could repackage the theology of singleness in my own life. So that's how I did it with the paper. And the number one verse that gets thrown at Christians when it comes to getting married and things like that is, I believe it's Genesis 1:28, where it says, "Be fruitful and multiply." And again, it's used as a retaliation against society's basically diminishing of family, the importance of motherhood and parenthood and marriage and things like that. And I get it that you're trying to be like, we have to push back against something that's false, and that's true, but we don't need to push back so much so that we end up at the far end of this pendulum swing, which then starts putting it on an unhealthy level. And I thought it would be interesting to discuss this because, again, it's almost like the number one response that you get, especially if somebody said, I don't want to be married. I don't want to have children, even if I get married. Then they're going to throw this verse at you. And so to understand what it's there for and whether or not it's sinful to choose singleness or choose childlessness. I think it's almost a worse sin in Christians' minds to get married and not have children on purpose than it is to not get married. And so I think, because if you could say, I just don't want to get married, they might go, oh, you have the gift of singleness, which is a whole other thing. But if you actually get married and you say, it's not that we can't have children, we've just chosen not to have children. And all of a sudden their minds explode and everybody melts down.
And it's usually the grandparents, because I anticipated having grandchildren and you're not giving me grandchildren. Did you know that it says in the Bible, be fruitful and multiply?
Yeah. And almost by saying that you're choosing childlessness, by saying you're pro one thing, it means that you're anti the other thing. So it's saying if I choose not to have children, then that means that I am saying that by having children, it's a lesser thing or something. It's like they somehow equate it with that. It's one equals the other, instead of saying I can choose childlessness or I can choose children. And they're both equal choices in front of God, as long as you're doing it in faith and you believe it's what God's calling you to do.
Yep. And there, in some cases, for some couples, there's a really valid reason for remaining childless. If you've got genetic disabilities that can get passed on, like cystic fibrosis, multiple sclerosis, a bunch of other diseases like that you don't want your children to suffer with the same things that affect you. There are reasons why people remain childless, and sometimes it's just infertility. And we shouldn't be demonizing them because they choose to not have children. That's our podcast for the day. Thank you. We're all done. We're all done.
I think the main thing is I almost want to push it as less to do with infertility or choice of protecting future children from possible disease or illnesses, and actually just go to the couple who say, we just don't want to have children, because it's almost like we can accept the exceptions to the rule in the sense of it's not their choice that they didn't have children. They just couldn't have children, or they would have children if it weren't for these extenuating circumstances. But for actually someone to come and say, we could very possibly have children, should we try, but we've chosen not to because we feel that's what God's calling us to do. And I think if somebody said that, people's heads would explode. That you thought God was calling you to childlessness, even though you could theoretically have children. And I think that's more
technically there are some people who shouldn't have children. Just saying.
Yeah. But again, it's like that's one of the exceptions to the rule. If you said, wow, I'm so glad those people didn't procreate.
Now that's not a very nice thing to say.
What do we say? Truth and love, truth and love, truth and love.
So let me try to get this right. I'm having a little difficult following what's going on here. Given God calls someone to marry, but then one of them die before children, pass away, effectively, cancer, whatever you want to call it, then where does that fit into your scenario? Because I'm not entirely sure your position on it, because it's gone up and down.
So it's basically, I'm saying like, that's again an extenuating circumstance or one of the exceptions that we would find palatable.
The reason.
Yeah. If he said we were going to have children, but he passed away or she passed away, we would be like, okay, they would have had children, but for this situation.
Yeah.
But I think by giving the example of two healthy individuals who have a lifelong of marriage and have felt the call of God to not have children, that's almost like I'm giving you a scenario where you can't just write off the reason.
So then what about call to support? For example, if God decides this person is struggling very dearly, and let's send someone or call someone to marry this person in support of their ministry.
Yeah. Then that's fine. That's the reason. Like you could say, it might give you reasons. Like they might say, we felt called to foreign ministry where it wouldn't be safe to have children. Or we feel called to, we're both in the military and we're constantly in danger, or those type of things, and we're always being whatever. Like we can give those situations, and then, but as a humanity or as a human person, like we need a reason in our that we feel like we need a reason of why we don't have children, instead of accepting that perhaps God has called them not to have children and they have a reason, but should they have to tell you that reason? Should they have to explain it? Or are you just going to immediately just condemn them and say, God says to be fruitful and multiply. It says that blessed is he who has a quiver full of children and all of these things. And you're just like,
this all stems from the Old Testament though.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And that's the point I want to make.
Yeah.
So I was just basically putting out there a couple who are completely believers. They're 100% Christians. They're not like just say they are whatever. You've seen the fruit in their lives. You've seen them do whatever. Okay. And then they say, oh, hey, you having a kid soon? Because a lot of people say that, even though it's none of their business. And they say, actually, we feel like God's calling us not to have children. And then they don't actually give you a reason that you can then accept and then say that, okay, they're Christian, obviously. But anyway, because then your verse, the thing goes to be fruit.
Why would the person choosing to not have children be obligated to give a reason to anyone?
Because we want one as a human people. We need to get our brains around. I know.
That doesn't
I'm
really matter.
And that's the point.
Right?
That's kind of the point.
You shouldn't be obligated to tell me something because I want you to tell me something. I'm really confused on what you're trying to...
But that's kind of the point. That's the point.
And it might be more that women hear that more than men, I think. Because it's one of those things that you want to be a mom. Doesn't every woman, baby, don't you want to feel that life growing inside of you and have that miracle of birth and you just
Have you
know,
read Genesis?
scary.
Isn't it a curse? Like, you will
The
bear
curse of all the
children in
stuff
utter
we-
pain?
Yes.
Willingly
And-
go.
And it proves that, but women actually do willingly do that because there is that. And I think this is one of those everybody says about women. Men don't have it because men don't have a biological clock. Technically, a man can father children pretty much almost
Forever.
the day he dies. Yeah. Not forever. He's got to eventually. If
Well,
it won't prove
there-
it.
sorry,
If it's
there's
sperm,
a.
it could be forever.
I feel like there's a discrepancy between what you're stating and what you're not stating. Because so, what exactly are you stating there, Monique? Because either you can also mother children until the day you die. You can't
No.
bear children.
You can't bear children.
You can
Bear
still
children.
mother children until the day you
Yeah.
die.
No, you get to a certain age and you just don't want to be that mother anymore. You just,
Well,
yes, I will
you wanna
take
be-
care.
but then
I will
that's
take
a,
care of your child for an hour
But then
or
that's a
two, but you
choice.
go home.
but then that's a choice. A father can still end up in that same position where he gets just tired of this and he can't do it anymore.
Oh, yes.
Right?
But if you take, for instance, a lot of these very rich and powerful men who've got scads of money, they will, like Elon Musk, he's got what? How many kids does he have? And with
I'm thinking
not,
Kanye West too.
To
Yeah,
be fair, most
that's
of these rich
because-
people just hire nannies.
yes, and that's exactly true. But if we're going to talk generally for people in just middle, lower class, whatever, we have a cutoff time where that's just no more children, bearing thing. I'm
Yeah, so-
tired. I want my life back, kind of thing, right?
So from
Or-
my point of view, it's more like actually getting pregnant and giving birth than it is actually raising a child in the sense. Cause
Yeah,
you can,
and I think
right?
for this example, it's just more they're not giving any reason. So in your brain, like your Christian brain, you're not able to just write it off as an acceptable
Yeah.
reason why they're not having children. We can't have children, or we have this genetic disorder in the family and we don't want to pass it along to children. And your brain, your Christian brain will take that and be like, okay, that's a valid reason. And then sometimes you'll say, but will you adopt or things like that? Because you push the point about having children.
Yeah. Don't you
Um,
want family? Why?
Yeah, are you
And
going to
and this is
adopt?
the
Is-
thing.
That's usually the follow-up question then.
Yeah.
Because the
And it-
accepted view is that you get married and you have children. Now, it does apply to singles in a sense, because as a single person, like it is a singles podcast, obviously, but the point is like a lot of times it gets pointed out to a single, especially single women, like when he said it's like there is a biological clock there, where it says, what are you waiting for getting married? Don't you want to have children? If you wait too long, you can't have children. So I was just trying to give a situation where our Christian brain won't accept. And that's saying you don't want to have children and you don't actually give a valid, quote unquote, valid reason for, and it's not just like every single person thinks this way, but the general consensus is this. So
Yeah.
we see, but that because our brain goes to, but it says be fruitful and multiply. It says a quiver full of children is a blessing. And we're not saying it's not. Okay.
No.
It doesn't say that children are not a blessing. Again, if you say that you don't want to have children, it doesn't mean that children aren't a blessing. It's not saying one is by not having children, you're saying this. So I think it's good to look at where we see this in the Bible. So again, we see it in Genesis. The first time we see it is Genesis 1:28. It says, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. So this is the first time we see this given, and it was given to Adam and Eve. So right now there's two people on the, so it
Be
does make
fruitful and
sense.
multiply. You got to fill the earth. There's not a whole heck of a lot of people.
So we're only at two people. And
And
so
then we
be
can get into
fruitful.
a whole other discussion of then who did their kids marry. You don't
Yeah.
want to talk about this right now because that will be a whole other theological
check
discussion
out-
that a lot of answers in Genesis.
Go out. Yeah, Google Answers in Genesis for that one. It has a good article about that. So the next time we see it is Genesis 9:1. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. Guess what? We were down to his 3 sons, Noah, and 3 wives. 1, 2, 3, 7 people.
And Noah's wife, but I don't think
Maybe Mrs. Noah. So 8. But I think Mrs. Noah is probably done with having kids.
Probably. I would be.
And how old
maybe
would,
not.
how old had they be? Like 8, 7, 6, 6, 700? Like when's the cutoff date? Because you could live to 1200.
Yeah, at this point, who
Yeah.
knows? So anyway, but we're down to 8 people, fill the earth and multiply.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the second time we see this one. The next time we see it is again to Noah. Genesis 9:7. As for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it. Again, to Noah and his children. Then we see it in Genesis 17:20 to Ishmael, Abraham's son Ishmael. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and greatly increase his number. Because remember that God promised Abraham that his children and his descendants would be like the sands of the sea and the stars in the sky. So just like multiplying them. And just because Abraham took control and decided that he was going to make a kid his way, it doesn't mean that God didn't honor that and bless both of his children and descendants, numbers of descendants. And he promised it to I think to Ishmael's mother as well, just because whenever she was, that Ishmael was going to die. So he said that he would bless. We also see Genesis 28:3 to Jacob, may God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and increase your numbers until you become a community of people. That's Isaac blessing Jacob before he goes to find a wife. So that is, again, that was Isaac blessing Jacob, but he was infusing or reminding that God's promise of multiplication of Abraham's descendants. But then God speaks directly to Jacob in Genesis 35:11, and God said to him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful, increase in number, a nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants. So again, that's about Abraham's promise, the promise to Abraham being generally blessing of descendants. And then we see Genesis 47:27 about the Israelites in Egypt. Now the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. This wasn't God saying it, but it was basically showing that they were being blessed by God and multiplying. So those are like all the points that we see this when it comes to actually talking to human beings. He actually talks about it towards the animals at one point too, like the sea creatures and things like that. Basically, this is the people that he gives it to. Like Adam, Noah, Jacob. And it's to fill the earth and then a promise that he would have many descendants. It's not then told over and over into all, it doesn't not follow into the New Testament. But what's interesting is we see that like we use it all the time as like God says we need to be fruitful and multiply. And yet, like, why did he tell them that? And we actually see that it is in the Old Testament, having children was commanded or expected because it was like you're passing the inheritance from one generation to the other. And God made arrangements for if you didn't have a son or he didn't have a child, then your brother would marry his brother's wife if the brother passed away without a child, and then the first child would be the original husband's considered their child.
Oh, I think you
Yes,
muted
yep.
yourself somehow.
Oh, I unmuted. Okay, I'm back.
Okay.
Sorry. I clicked it, but I must not have clicked it again because I was coughing. So we see it given in the Old Testament. And we see as we read through, if you're reading through the Old Testament, you get to an incessant amount of genealogies or these people having these people and these people, like, because it was very important that they would line up all the genealogies. But you see it in the Old Testament up until Jesus. And we actually see the genealogy to Jesus in the first part of the New Testament. And that's all the genealogies we ever get again. Because it was actually about getting from Adam to Jesus. And that was the purpose, like the purpose of following all these lineages and aside from God using it as a blessing, like blessing the nations and descendants. But we actually see that we move from Adam all the way through to Jesus. And then that's the last genealogies in the Bible. Because at that point, when Jesus comes, he actually gives a new command at that point, which is go and make disciples of all nations.
It flips.
So
he fulfilled
yeah.
multiply.
Yep.
The multiplying.
And I just want to point out something that maybe other people saw, but I only saw for the first time when I was studying this, is that even if
Sorry, Natasha,
Yep.
you start cutting in and out now.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Even if the people had obeyed God, so Abraham had not had Ishmael, Jacob had just married Leah and not Rachel. If we look at that way, Jesus still would have come to be, because
that's what people call predestination. Jesus was predestined to come.
yeah. And all I mean is a lot of people will talk about, oh, look, Jacob had 12 sons. It's look how many kids he had, and he was blessed because of it, and blah, blah, blah. But if you actually look at it, Judah, which is where Christ comes through, was Leah's son. And so also the other thing is, if you actually look at the people who have lots of children in the Bible, they had several wives, and the wives only have 3 or 4 kids, maybe 5. But they always go, look, Jacob had 12 kids. I want to have 12 kids. I'm like, I'm sorry, you have just you having 12 kids. If you look at Jacob having 12 kids, there was 4 women involved. And that was 4 sons. There were some daughters in there, at least one. So
It's a small army, man.
yeah. And so I just found it interesting how we always talk about having these large families, and that it's biblical that we have these large families, and we have a quiver full, even though we don't actually get told how much a quiver is. But if you look at Abraham, he had 2 kids. If you look at Isaac, he had the twins. If you look at Jacob, he had 12, but there was 4 women involved. If you actually look at it, if you look at Mrs. Noah, she had 3 sons. It's just we talk about how we're just going to have all these children and that. But it doesn't mean you can't have all the children. Okay. If you choose to do, that's fine. But I don't think you're more holy because you had 12 children. The couple who choose to not have children.
Also,
if you're curious, but because I just can't help myself, how many, when you say a quiver full, with a quiver holds arrows, so that's the number of arrows in a quiver. Back in the day, it used to be between 6 and 20 arrows. Nowadays, the capacity is between 4 and 7. So.
Yeah. So
never...
also point, if you want to have 12 kids, don't have 4 wives.
Yeah, exactly. If it's not a prescriptive, this is just what happened. And if you look at it, it was not a happy household.
No. And we see that with others, like with David and with Solomon, who had multiple wives. The amount of problems that they have between the jealousy and the rivalries and stuff, that they say sibling rivalry.
Also, I believe
even in families where you only have one mom and one dad, there's still sibling rivalry even among the children. So,
also, I believe I believe it says too that after Solomon had all this, he fell into sin, and then he had all these wives and stuff, and then he came back to the Lord. So it depicts him, that whole segment of time he was in sin as well. So
yeah, but if you look at it too, again, they had a lot of children.
Yeah,
but they were spread across many wives and concubines or whatever. It's not Mrs. David had a bunch of. This one Mrs. David had all of the children. It was spread out over multiple wives. Guess David was busy. I guess the baby king and having this many concubines, you gotta keep him happy. But it's just interesting just to see if we actually look at it. The purpose of the be fruitful and multiply was a command given to populate the earth, and was later to Abraham was a promise given that God would be the one to do this. And if you look during the Old Testament, if God was blessing a people, they were being fruitful and multiplying. They were having children. It said in one of the parts of Deuteronomy, it actually talks about part of the blessing is that if you're following my commands, then neither male or female would be barren or would be infertile, so that they would just be having being able to have children. But then as soon as there was a curse, then it had to do with not being able to have children. And also things like when the king took Sarah to be his wife, Abraham's wife, because Abraham just said he was his sister, then God closed all the wombs and then they became barren and infertile, which was like a curse. But we only see that again in the Old Testament. When we hit the New Testament and the fulfillment of everything that God has been doing up in Christ, and if being a parent and being married were required to have a fulfilled life and to have a God-blessed life, then Jesus did it wrong. Because he didn't have children. He didn't get married or have children. So it's either Jesus is not God and he sinned and not having that, or he is God and he's not capable of sin. And he actually showed that you can have a fulfilled, productive life as a person who is single and childless. Because at that point, when he talks about giving if you notice, like, he tells his disciples that you are to be fishers of men.
Well, Jesus,
And so,
And he also said that in heaven there will be no marriage or being given in marriage.
yes, yeah, that's I think I mentioned this on many other podcasts that we've done, but again, marriage is something that was created for us. It wasn't some divine
Right.
thing that persisted. So it was created for our well-being, and it's not something that will persist into heaven.
persist,
Yeah.
as we go on. And if you actually look at all the verses that have to do with family, children, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, in the New Testament, it's all about the spiritual family. It's about the church family. And like when he talks about, when he gets told that his mother and brothers are looking for him, and he says, "Who are my mother and brothers?" It's just, that's not saying that Mary and his brothers weren't his biological mother and brothers, but it was saying that that it wasn't what made family now. That wasn't what they were, his spiritual mother and brothers now, as well as biological. And it wasn't as important, the biological ties, as the spiritual ties.
Yeah.
And so we see that in the New Testament, the shift changes. And so if we're told to go out and be fruitful and multiply, and the Old Testament is physical, then how do we be fruitful and multiply in the spiritual in the New Testament? And that is to go and make disciples, to bring more into the church. Even though God's in charge of that, we are told to go and do and to be a part of it. And so,
what does he say? Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, exactly. So it's that now we have a new family unit that is created and is shown to us in the New Testament. And so we are to go and be fishers of men. We are to go and feed. He tells to Peter to go feed my sheep and things like that. So it's all spiritual at this point. It's not physical.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that you can't have children and disciple them and do like your job in bringing them into the family of God. But it doesn't mean that's like the main way of doing it now.
Yeah, it's not that they're saying, oh, you can't ever get married now. It's all a different thing. It's just that the importance of it has diminished because now our mandate has changed from filling the earth and subduing it into go and make disciples of all nations.
Yeah, the purpose of it has been fulfilled.
And I find like when I see like even a lot of Christian talks or podcasts and things like that, when it talks about like raising up children, they actually say, I want to raise my son to be to be a godly husband and my daughter to be a godly wife. And I'm like, I understand the concept behind that, but the point is that you should be raising them to be a godly person. And if they are
and like
being
God
raised,
determine what their future is.
yeah, and that's if you raise your son to be a godly man, then he should be able to be a godly husband. If you raise your daughter to be a godly woman, then she should be able to be a godly wife. And if you are married, then you should be showing what it is to be a godly husband and a godly wife. And if you have children, it should be showing what it means to be a godly father and a godly mother. So they should have those like examples.
Already.
But if you a point in your head that the reason that you're teaching them is that they can one day be something that you don't know they're going to be, like you're diminishing because you have not taught them how to be a godly single. And you're gearing their entire life. These parents who
But how would
put their kids into sports and then they're like crazy about getting their kids so good at that sport because they were good at it or they wanted to be good at it. So they're like,
Yeah.
and
You're
projecting it
going-
onto their kids.
yeah.
And
You are going to be you're going to be the best at this, and you're going to make gads of them. It's always the fame, the power, the fame, and the money. It's just let the kids play.
out of curiosity,
I had-
Natasha, how would a parent teach singleness if their whole life goal was not to be single?
Because it's like how to be a godly person, regardless of your circumstance. And it's like, if you're single, then you are going to focus a little bit on purity and the fact that you don't want to be doing these things when you're not married, but it doesn't mean like sex and some of the things that you're doing. Like you need to teach them what it means to be single, but also like that the focus isn't about, okay, now that you're done high school or college or whatever, now your focus needs to be on getting married. Instead, it's like actually in like going, okay, what's God calling you to do in this time? What do you think God's calling you to do in the future? What can you do to progress to that point? And I think when we put things like parenthood and marriage as a goal, then you end up making it your job to do that. Like you focus all your energy into getting married. And then it's okay, now I have to have kids. So I'm going to focus all my energy so that I can be a parent. Instead of being like, yes, you could be on the lookout for a potential spouse, like person that could be a good spouse through friendship and things that are going on around you. But if you by making it your goal, like there's only so much you can do.
Okay. So I guess the real question then becomes like, how do we make parents or people who have married, who grew up with this notion that they have to get married and have kids, who've already done this, how do we make them aware that they need to teach their children of singleness?
Yeah, and this is where our ministry has been a great thing. If you are a single person, talking to your married friends about how they talk to their kids is important. And we've noticed that Pastor Adam, when we explained to him what our goal is, that we, as a parent, we can't assume that their life plan is to get married, because what if it's not? And then you end up causing grief and frustration in your adult child because their goal in life isn't being fulfilled as they had been taught to grow up with. And he said, we never thought of that before. So instead of saying, when you get married, it's more if you get married or if you don't get married. It's all up to God's plan for your life. God might have something different for you. You may not get married. And he said, we never thought of thinking it. And it is, you have to shift how you think. You have
because like, I think it's all these subtle things, right? Of saying like, when you get married, then this will happen, or you'll understand this, or then whatever.
Yeah. When you have kids of your own.
Yeah, you'll understand what it's like when you have kids of your own. But again, it's not like they may never. The chances of people getting married and having children is very high, I think, in a sense. But what if God's plan for that person involves them not finding the person they're going to marry until they're 35?
Yep.
Let's just say. Like, what does that mean from their 20s and the first part of their 30s? Are they sitting there going, man, I'm not married. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I can't really start my life. All these things happen. And like, oh, I'm a woman. I'm like, oh, 30. Like, I'm already in my 30s and I haven't had kids. What does that?
Just ticking.
Yeah. Like, if you are like so like focused on these things, like they're a goal, then you start to like your whole life is focused around getting to those goals, even though you don't really have as much control over them as you'd like to have. Especially like what if you get married and you want to have children and it's not happening? Then you start to fret over the fact that another month has gone by and you still have your period, or the pregnancy test was negative, and you just like focus and focus and focus on that instead of what God's calling you in the time. And I think it's like by focusing so much and saying you're supposed to get married, you're supposed to have kids. Oh, my video
Yeah.
is being weird.
Yep. You're freezing.
I'm
And
all
frozen.
And I guess I'm going to be like this for the rest of the time. New meme.
The gestures that you freeze in, though, Natasha.
That's it. I can't just be me sitting here now. So we
Oh,
don't
well.
have too much longer anyway. Sorry, people who
no.
are watching. This is what you get.
This is
This is what you get,
Natasha.
people.
Listen to me.
Listen.
Listen. I just want you to listen to me. Just hear me here.
Just-
Where am I heard that?
Oh my
Go
word! I
ahead.
can't believe it froze again. People watching, this is frozen. If you're not watching, thank goodness, because you can just listen. And I lost my train of thought. But I just think because I grew up with this whole idea that being not even like they're saying be fruitful and multiply, but that's the verse that gets thrown out if you counter the narrative. But the idea that you're supposed to get married and supposed to have children, and that I wanted those things. Like I honestly wanted them, and they're good things to want. Okay, they're not bad things to want. But
on the keyboard.
all of my focus of my life was then geared toward achieving those things. So you like for a Christian, you're not going to have children unless you're married. Like, the way God wants it to happen, marriage and children. So I had to get married. So then I was focusing on that. I was like going to events. That's the only reason I went to university as a Christian university was basically that. I was going on dating sites. Like I was focusing on the fact that all the people around me were getting married and I wasn't. And it was depressing and everything became about that because that's what you were told was supposed to happen or that's what the expectation was. But if you actually start to train people instead of saying, don't you want to have kids? Like, what are you waiting for? I hate that, but it's what people say. It drives me bonkers, but people even still say that to me now. So you're beautiful. What are you waiting for? And I'm just like, ugh. It's just because I'm fine. Okay.
As though looks has anything to do with anything.
I know. It's like, you're a beautiful young woman. You can do it. I'm just like, okay. I don't know if I believe that part, but anyway, whatever. That's not the point. But the point is like, if you actually start saying to teaching your children that you need to find out what God's calling you to do in whatever moment that you're finding yourself in, like you stop framing their entire life around this expectation that may not be what God's calling them to do at that point in their life. And so you start to open up the possibilities of where your life is going. And to open these possibilities is, I don't know, I wish I had that. Like now that I've been able to open up my mind to that, or God used it to open up my mind to those things, it's created so many more options in my life that weren't there before. And I wish that I had that mindset in my 20s, that I had been taught that not everybody gets married then, that it's okay if you're not. That like these things were never outright said to you, even though I think Christians would like agree with the statements. It's never really said to you. You're never raised with that mentality where like singleness, it's not about whether you're married or having children. It's about you're about the Great Commission. Like we talk about the Great Commission in church on a Sunday or something. We'll have a sermon on it, but we're actually not taught how to live it out as a single person or as a person that's being raised like a teenager, what that looks like. Instead, we're like, well, you go to school, you get married, you have children, and the way that we celebrate life focuses around that. It focuses around like engagements and weddings, baby showers, first child, second child, things like that. That's where a lot of celebrations happen, anniversaries. And unless you just keep living and having a birthday, that's pretty much the only celebration you get as a single person. And if you make it to a
going to be celebrating, we will be celebrating a significant birthday next week.
Yes.
Yeah. And once you get up into those older ages, people start letting everybody know how old you're getting.
Yeah.
Don't tell people
if you
that
live long enough, if you live long enough, and it has to be about 70 and up to be actually announced in church that you're still alive. People are going, really? They're still alive? I thought they passed away already. Okay. You get to that age.
Hey,
As a single person, you're basically like an unknown background person. And I'm not saying that we have to celebrate every single thing, but what I mean is that a lot of our celebrations are focused around marriage and children and less around just like things that God's calling you to be married and have children. Great. That's a celebration. But God's calling us to a lot of different things, and those should be celebrated as well. And I don't have all the answers of what needs to be announced in church because it could turn into an entire sermon just on announcements. But
I think eventually there's going to come certain announcements for the single people when they're going off onto the mission field and having them come up and we pray for them like we do when people have babies. We're going to baptize you. Here's all the babies in the family and everybody come up. And we do that when we have the mission teams. When somebody in the church has decided that God has called them out to the mission. And I think we've done that with one person. But his family is already there. He is a missionary in Haiti.
okay.
And they're announcing that. That's a pretty cool thing to do. Is if you know that this person is going off into the mission field, we've had a bunch of single people that have done that. And so that's one of the things that, or they
like sometimes it's just you're going about life and there's nothing like official to celebrate. And I don't think you need to bring up every single personal accomplishment in church or whatever or celebrate it. But I think that's where like a singles ministry or event where people are getting together and they could be like, oh, guess what? Like I felt God calling me to talk to this person at work and it went like this. And you can within a group like really celebrate the fact that God was moving and felt the call of him, or you felt like, oh, I really feel God calling me to this job and whatever. And it's not a magical thing of going to mission field, which is a completely positive and good thing to do, but God calls people different ways. But I think it's just, that's why it's good to get involved in like a community where they can actually just celebrate the personal things that God is calling you to do as a single person. And it's just, I don't know. I don't have all the answers, obviously. But it's just, and this is a new sort of field in the church is this idea that singleness is acceptable, even though it shouldn't be because it's been since Jesus came and lived as single life. That would be enough of it.
You had 5,000, 6,000 years prior of cultural celebration around marriage before.
And I think that probably has a lot to do with it is that we have been preconditioned through generations that marriage and children are
hundreds and thousands of generations.
I know. Yeah. So the paradigm shift is starting to happen now already because a lot of people are recognizing that, especially with the infertility rate being actually high for this generation, a lot of people are recognizing that a lot of people struggle and that they can't always children and that there are now such a massive unbalance between the male population and the female population that there are going to be typically more females unable to get married because there's just no male base for them to get married. I mean, even in our own church, maybe not so much now with the younger, but around when I was like about 10 years ago, the ratio between male and female, and that might still in Natasha's age, where there's one guy, but there are 5 girls. We don't have those big marriages like that. We're not back then in that time. So there is going to be a lot more single female, and then a lot of men are choosing not to get married. And then, of course, there's also there's a whole lot of other aspects of why people aren't getting married nowadays. So I think there's a shift in that. So some people are recognizing that. So I'm not hearing, why aren't you married yet? And now especially that I'm older. So I don't know.
It's just, I think it's just the Jesus and Christianity has always been like a cultural pushing or putting culture on its head. And I think when we see that there's so many cultures and so much of society is so focused on having children, like the expectation to get married and have children. And yet Christianity is saying, hey, wait, this isn't as important as you think it is. What's actually more important is the disciple, like going and making disciples, like that, the moving the kingdom. That is what God's calling us to do now. So all of a sudden the paradigm shift of, wait, we don't have to get married and have children as the norm. We can do that. And we are called to have children within marriage. We're called, and when we do get married and have children, we are called to be godly parents and spouses. But instead of the focus being that, and it's now be creating like your spiritual family and being the parents or the friends or the siblings of the church family. And it doesn't mean that we only deal with church family, like in the sense of I'm only going to deal with Christians. It's actually, we're called to go and make disciples of all nations, those who are not believers. So we're called to go out there and preach the word and speak the word and to live the word and all these things. And if that was our focus, that's what we start teaching our children or our young people or our singles, is that God's calling you to go and make disciples. How are you going to do that? And first it starts with yourself. Like you have to grow in maturity and spiritual maturity in yourself. It doesn't mean that you wait till you're done. Yeah, you don't wait till you're spiritually mature and then you go out, but you work towards that goal. You are building up in yourself. And then you start to go out and you find places where you can mentor and serve, and you build a community. And you do all these things. So you may get the option to be like a spiritual father or mother or something like that, where you're mentoring and you're helping the babies or the children and the Christianity to come up. And so you're meeting needs outside of the community and within the community. That sounds like an insane amount of responsibility. I don't know, like adding actual marriage and children, like biological, it sounds like a lot more work. So we can see why where Paul says, I wish that you could be as I am. Because if you're not married, then you don't have these other things pulling at you, other divided loyalties, which is interesting. Because if this is our calling to go and make like disciples of all nations, then yeah, being married and having kids can not hold you back, but it's not a negative, because they are a blessing from God. But it does make it more difficult to fully commit to something, because you do have quite appropriately other responsibilities. Like you can't just deny the responsibilities and forsake your spouse and children for the sake of the kingdom is not a good thing. I've seen way too many great, quote unquote, great Christian speakers and pastors who have done these quote unquote great things at the expense of their family. And God's so perhaps maybe some of these people who did do these fantastical things as a pastor were actually called to be single, but because of society and their own desires, they actually got married and had children, but then they didn't, like they chose to leave those responsibilities. And I think that
they lived like they were single.
And so how
and
many
then a
times
lot of
are I
them falls
actually,
into sin.
but even I just know, like, they didn't necessarily fall into sins in the sense of like sexual sin, but they had zero relationship with their children, and their children wanted nothing to do with them. And it's just so perhaps God was calling them to a single life, and they didn't heed the call. You don't know if God was gifting them these things and calling them to do these things for the kingdom, then it would have been better for them to not have had children and a spouse, because they obviously let those responsibilities go. They didn't divide their loyalty, which they should have done.
Well, I remember when I first became a Christian and I heard the phrase PKs, and I didn't know what that meant. And then those are preacher kids. And a lot of children or young adults who were preacher kids, they hated that, because they said, all my dad did was serve the church and was always helping other people. And he was always gone doing this, that, and the other thing. He was never home. It's when you're married with kids and you want to serve the Lord, you have to be very
wise.
It's divided.
Well, if there was a word and it flittered in and out of my brain. You have to be very purposeful would be about how you do your time. You've got to make sure that you do not neglect your family and your children, and that may require you to step back from some of your responsibilities and pass them on to other people to do, so that you are not pulled in all directions and your family is sacrificed.
Exactly. So remember that having children, getting married, having children, while it is a blessing, it is a stress on your time and your energy and your focus and your responsibilities. So that if you are feeling God's calling to do something, you need to ask yourself, is this something I can do as a married person? And so you have to do that.
Yep. I remember when I was early single after with Amber being disabled and still wanting more kids, but I wasn't in a relationship, so there was no way of having any more kids. But there were times when I would want it so much, but then I would have that, wait a minute, why don't you think about what that would imply in regards to Amber and the time you spent with her, and what would happen if your focus was that you couldn't spend a whole lot of time with her because you had all your time to spend with your new family. And my heart couldn't deal with it. My heart didn't like that at all. And I had to make that very real decision that getting married and having more kids was not where my life needed to go anymore.
It's
I think-
what people would go through when having a family and serving the church.
Yeah.
But I don't
Yeah.
I think most of them will suppress what you felt. They don't,
Yeah.
or they
Yeah.
won't understand what you felt. And you were lucky to understand, or not lucky. Lucky's not the right word, but
Yeah. It required a lot of prayer to get to the point of letting it go. And as time went on and age went on, and I just realized that my perspectives, my prospects were getting less and less, to the point where it was just like, what am I doing? Focusing on something that may never happen and letting that go. And I think there was a time where I actually kind of shied away from life for a while because I felt like that I wasn't good enough.
didn't have
And that was why that was why this was happening to me, is because my life was cursed. I felt that. But it wasn't long before God cleansed me. And I went through a lot of anger, and you may end up going through some of that as well as you struggle and wrestle with God over these issues of whether or not marriage and children is for your life. But God won't leave you in that space. He will bring you out of that space, and you will find your life better enriched at the end of it once you come to the realization that it's not something that you need, that God is what you need, and all these other things are just wants.
Yeah. And God's calling us to make disciples of all nations. So that's your
Yeah.
primary calling, not to go forth and multiply. That was the Old Testament calling.
Yeah.
Again, it does not mean that getting married and having children is wrong or less good. It's just a road, a path that you may be called to, but you might not be called to it, or you may not be called to it in this moment.
Here, Sheeta
I feel like it's
was
a
in the
binary.
flowers.
I feel
She's
like
walking around with a flower in her mouth.
I feel like it's a binary calling though, Natasha. You're either called to one or the other. There's not like a middle ground, really.
Oh. Yeah, I think some people do get married like later in life, but if you're, might persist for
that
a
still
purpose,
fits
or-
with what I said though. It's
Yeah, I guess what you mean.
Okay.
So in the moment that you're in, you're called to singleness or marriage, not both. Is what you're meaning. Yeah.
Again, actually, just another way to express it is, I guess, legacy. Like a lot of what people believe now for non-believers, all they have is what their legacy brings, right? And I don't even know how to express it, but the magnificent magnitude that Jesus showed us in regards to our legacies demonstrates that there's an alternative legacy. Like in the Old Testament, for example, the legacy was to multiply. Your legacy would be your children, etc., etc. So marriage was the bringer of legacy. Then Jesus demonstrated that there was another legacy, and then that's our discipleship, our ability to create a legacy, not through our children, but through expressing our belief to others and then having them express their belief. So our legacies would be those who we talk to, those who come to Christ, those who God helps us call out to effectively.
Exactly. I think that's a good point to end on. We're getting over the hour mark now, so people.
Yeah, we don't want them to. Just in case any of you caught that little thing about our cat walking around with a flower in her mouth. What a weirdo. We only have state flowers. It's not that one. But it did look quite comical, I have to admit. It's a weirdo.
So, yeah. So here's a good closing verse, Isaiah 54:1, which is an interesting part about this is that it is an Old Testament verse. But sing, barren woman, because more are the children of the desolate woman than of her who has a husband. So God has promised a blessing for those who
have no children.
If that you are following what God wants you to do, if you are obeying him and being close to him, then he will bless you with the spiritual children. And your desires of your heart will be met. It's just in a different way than you first thought.
Yep. Look at you.
Okay.
Because you teach how many children all week long? By the time Saturday comes around, you don't want to see kids anymore.
I just need a day.
I just need to get my brain back. Yep.
So thank you for joining us as we talked about fruitfulness and multiplying, and hope that we said some things that resonated with you and that can help you on your journey. If you want to, please leave a message, leave a review or a rating or any of these things. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and YouTube and TikTok. So you can find us all over the place. Subscribe, all those things. So we shall see you all here next time.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
For joining us on today's episode of the Route 77 podcast. If nothing else, we hope you're walking away knowing this. Being fruitful and multiplying was never about babies. In Christ, it's about growing the kingdom through love, through service, through discipleship, whether you're married or not. Your legacy isn't limited to bloodlines. God is calling you to live a fruitful life right now, exactly where you are. If today's conversation encouraged you, challenged you, or just gave you something to think about, share it with a friend, leave a review, or connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, X, or YouTube. Until next time, keep walking the road of faith and remember to live your single life to its fullest.